Okay, hello everyone. Um, Hopefully you had a chance to watch the last video on the world system from 1200 to 1450. If not, you may want to go back and watch that one first because obviously they are in chronological order. And what we looked at from 1200 to 1450 will definitely apply in terms of looking at changes and continuities from 1450 to 1750. So make sure you go watch that one. Before you watch this. All right, so what we want to look at today is the changes in the world system from 1450 to 1750. This is a pretty important time period. So what we'll do is we'll kind of start by giving a real brief overview of what we'll look at. And then we'll kind of take a step back a little bit and look at that 1200 to 1450, what the world system looked like at that point, and then kind of take you through some of these details to refresh what we looked at during the school year. Okay? So if we look at this period, we can kind of come at it with a look at the transformation that's going to occur, right? So kind of translating this again into the wording that College Board may use. So evaluate the extent to which global exchange networks were transformed, right? Now, what we're looking at here, is this period, right? Right in the middle. So again, it's important to know what was happening here from 1200 to 1450, so we can look at those continuities and changes between these two periods. And it's also important to, have knowledge of what happens afterward too. Because if you're writing a DBQ on this period and you're thinking about, tying this across time periods, you may want to finish by looking at what happens after this period, right? It's always a good piece of information to put in there. So again, we'll focus primarily on this today. We'll back up a little bit, do a little bit of review with this, and then we'll dive in here and see what's going on. Now, first, I want to quickly kind of do an overview of what we're going to look at here. And then, like I said, we'll get into it. So, the big idea here, if we're thinking globally, right, is that we're going to move from a multipolar world system. That's what we had here, right? You had China, you had the Arab world, you had India, etc. All these different poles who are contributing to the system. And, we're going to start to lose that during this period and start moving to what we would call like a hegemonic world system, where there's this one powerful entity that's trying to control world trade, right? And we'll look at a couple of examples of that. Okay, so again, we're going to move from this older system that's these overlapping circuits. Nobody's really dominating it, to a system where you're going to have people who are trying to dominate it, right? Primarily these European states. Okay, so what we'll look at is we'll start out by examining this Iberian-Italian system, right? The Spanish and the Portuguese. Okay, and one of the key factors there is where do they get their money from, right? So we'll take a look at these Italian city-states real briefly too, especially the Genovese merchants, really, really important, or bankers, I should say, in financing what Spain and Portugal are doing, right? Important to remember, these people in Spain and Portugal are dependent on Asian, African, and American production and resources, right? They're not producing this stuff in Spain and Portugal, right? They're going to these places, getting these products, and reselling them essentially, right? And then, we'll move into the Dutch system. So, this is kind of based on some of the work of some scholars like Giovanni Arrighi, Manuel Wallerstein, etc. So after this Spanish-Portuguese system begins to fall apart, the Dutch kind of take that over, right? And the big change you'll see between these two is you don't have this kind of alliance between, say, Spain and these bankers, right? That's all happening internally now. So you'll get this internal private investment in the Dutch system. So if you remember, we talked about these joint stock companies, stock markets the Dutch can invest in, right? So they're going to bring it all together kind of under one nation state. right? So they can do it all. But, you know, they're also dependent on these Asian, these African, these American products and resources too, right? They're not really producing stuff in the Netherlands, right? They're going to these places, getting it and reselling it. So we'll take a look at that. Now, this is primarily this period that we're looking at, right? 1450 to 1750. Now I want to move forward just a little bit, just so you have this information as we go through, okay? The next thing that'll happen in this next time period, 1750 to 1900, is the Dutch are going to lose their hegemonic status, right, to the British. Okay? And we can kind of see how that's going to happen, right? They're going to follow that Dutch model of internal private investment, right? This capitalist model, okay? But they can couple that with internal production, okay? Because they're going to have this industrial revolution in Great Britain, right? So they've got private capitalist investment, you've got internal production, okay? Now, if you look back up here to compare these things, they are still dependent on colonial resources, right? We looked at the environment of Britain, can't grow cotton there, right? So they're still having to go to India to get their raw cotton to turn into textiles in Great Britain, right? They can't grow opium in Great Britain, right? So they'll use India for that. They can sell that to China and use some of the benefits of the Industrial Revolution to kind of force China open to this kind of free trade idea, right? Of selling opium to them by using ironclad ships, industrial warfare, okay? And then kind of the final phase of this new system that we see is that U.S. system, right, which will take over in the 20th century. Okay? Again, internal private investment, right, capitalism. We also have internal production, right? We're going to industrialize. But then we also have another advantage that the British did not have, which we have this continental supply of internal resources, right? We stretch all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So when we think about colonialism, right, from the British, right, their dependency on these colonial resources, we don't really have to go overseas to do that, right? We can do it internally. It is a version of colonialism, right? Settler colonialism. As we push westward, the U.S. is pushing native people off of their land. They're taking their resources, they're relocating them, they're going to war with them. It's not a good deal. So the U.S. is able to combine all three of these things to become this hegemon, right? Now, again, these two are this next time period. But like I said, you want to know what's happening on both sides of this. Okay? All right. Now, to get back into the review of what we were looking at before, and I won't spend any time on this. This is from Origi's text, so if you want to look at it in kind of graph form, you can see the Spanish Genovese period, this Dutch period, this British period, this U.S. period. Okay? So if you want to pause it and take some time with that, be my guest. All right, so if we step back to that previous time period, that 1200 to 1450 period, we've got these core regions, right? You've got South Asia, you've got China, you've got the Middle East, the Arab Islamic world, right? Multipolar world system, right? And then if we look at some of the major powers here, right before this period of European intrusion into this world system, China's super powerful system, right? I mean, their sphere of diplomacy is huge. This is that period where they send Zhang He out on his voyages, where he makes it all the way to East Africa, etc. Right? And this is right before Europe starts sending people around Africa. Okay, now they're going to pull back on this. China will. Okay? And then you look at the Ottoman sphere of influence and diplomacy, right? Really important place. Right? And again, something to remember here. This is kind of the crossroads between East and West, right? Europe, if they're going to get goods from the East, they're typically coming through here, right? Through Islamic territories, the Ottoman Empire, etc. Right? Now, this map should be easily recognizable to you from the last time. These are these circuits of trade that we looked at. Excuse me. And we'll see how this is going to change in this next time period from 1450 to 1750. Right? These are still going to be important circuits of trade, but significant changes are going to occur too. right? So the world will end up looking more like these kind of circuits of trade, right? You'll have this eastern circuit of trade still centered around the Indian Ocean, right? But then we're going to add this Atlantic system to it as well. And then you'll have these interconnections between the eastern system, and the Atlantic system, connected, going around Africa, or as we'll see, crossing the Pacific too. So we get some major changes to the world system here. It's really, truly becoming a world system at this point, right? Complete interconnections here. Okay. This is from Eric Ross. If you remember looking at these, we did some cartography, some map work on these. This is a great map that kind of tells you what's happening in each region during this period. Okay, so you may want to pause, take a look at that, take a screenshot of it. Really excellent map. You've got your products in here, etc. So really good resource to have. Again, looking at trade routes here, right? What has changed during this period? So you've got your trade routes split among European powers, etc. And then you've got some colonial holdings on here too. So again, another excellent resource to look at for this time period. All right, now let's get into this Spanish Italian system and see how this works out, right? So if we back up a little bit, go back to that 1200 to 1450 period, these Italian city-states are really important in terms of getting these Eastern goods into Europe, right? So you've got this grouping of Italian city-states, right? Venice, Genoa. However, over time, you're going to hit the limits of profitability here, right? There's only so many goods you can bring in, only so many people you can sell these to. So you get this really extreme competition. If you remember in your reading of Marx, he talks about the armed trading that's happening in here, fighting over these trade routes, who's controlling them, who's expanding them, etc. So what ends up happening? How do they kind of lose their power in Europe to places like Spain and Portugal and Amsterdam eventually? Well, Genoa, they're pretty smart about this, right? So instead of investing in these trade routes that are already here, right, and defending them and fighting over them, they decided to just go into finance, right? So any surplus profits you have, rather than investing that in defending these routes, expanding these routes, bringing goods in, all the kind of dirty, dangerous stuff that goes along with that, said, hey, let's just finance other people to do this, right? And their big client state here is going to be Spain, right? So you'll have this financial connection between the Genovese bankers, creditors, and the Spanish monarchs, right? Now, the problem with this is if Spain is going to borrow all this money, they obviously have to pay it back, right? So again, you've got the finance, you're going to let Spain do this kind of dangerous work of trade, right? Expansion of trade networks. But, they got to repay the debt, and you don't want to just repay the debt. You want to make a profit too. Okay, so how are you going to do that, right? And, again, this gets pretty dirty, right? The Spanish are going to do some pretty terrible stuff here. And if you want to look at it holistically, you can kind of see what goes down here, right? Here's Spain. Spanish colonization of the Americas is going to occur here, right? And they're essentially going to use the resources and the people of the Americas to pay off these debts to these bankers, right? So a lot of the silver that's going to end up coming out of here, it's going to come to these creditors, right? And then some of it will go back to Madrid, right? So we'll look at a couple of the consequences of producing wealth here, right? And we'll use two examples. We'll use sugar and we'll use silver. If you remember, we talked about both of those in class. You can always go back and look at your documents and your resources on that too, to kind of supplement what we're looking at here today. Okay? Right. So if we think about the environmental history of sugar, we talked about this quite a bit in class, right? Last time period, we saw sugar coming out of India. They had learned how to crystallize it or dehydrate it, right? take the moisture out so you can pack it and ship it, and it won't just rot, right? It's storable. Okay? It makes its way into the Arab world. It's planted in the Tigris, Euphrates valleys, other fertile areas of the Middle East. There's some Mediterranean islands that are growing it. And then we saw the first sugar in the Atlantic out here at Madeira, right? With the Portuguese, right? They set up the Madeira Islands as these sugar islands, brought in some slave labor to terrace the landscape, put in these water features to water it, all that. Okay? Really environmentally destructive, right? They'd cut down the timber, burned a lot of the island down. It's really, really intensive process. Right? And that's one of the photos from Madeira today, right? The stuff is still there. So that's their water system, so they can actually water this sugar cane. Right? And you can see it's all terraced out here. Right? Really, really labor-intensive work. And then we get to the New World, right? And this is where we're going to see a major change in sugar production, right? This is going to be a real shift in how a lot of things work in terms of producing sugar, in terms of the labor systems that go into it, etc. Okay, so here we've got an image of sugar production in the New World, right? So you have Native American laborers doing most of the work here, right? And again, this sugar is really, really labor intensive, okay? You have to grow it and you have to process it, right? So you see the processing here, obviously. And you also need timber for the processing, right? Because you've got to heat it. You've got to cook off that moisture. You've got to dehydrate it out. So you have people out cutting trees down too, right? So again, super, super labor intensive process. So who's going to do the work? We talked about this in class. This encomienda system is going to get set up, this kind of forced indigenous labor system, right? And then you'll start to see the beginnings of this forced African labor system in the Americas too, this chattel slavery system, right? The plantation system. So make sure you're familiar with both of those. We'll come back to chattel slavery here in just a little bit and dig into a little more details there too. And we'll see what that means for Africa and for the African diaspora in the New World as well. Okay. Now, don't forget, this is also part of the Columbian Exchange, right? Sugar's not native, right? We looked at the map a second ago. Sugarcane's coming over from this part of the world, okay? And you've got all these other crops that are being exchanged too, right? So you've got this biological exchange of materials, okay? And it's going to have environmental consequences, right? You bring animals over, for example, cattle, you put them in a place where they've never been, and could go well, could go very terribly, right? If you remember, I talked about my thesis was on this very thing, bringing cattle into this region of the United States, the desert Southwest, where they just kind of wreck this ecosystem around the Gila River. That whole watershed was really, really disrupted by bringing these cattle in. Right? But you can look at it the other way too, right? Think about these carbohydrates that are going to move from the Americas into Afro-Eurasia, things like maize and potatoes, and how transformative that'll be in this part of the world, right? You're adding these new carbohydrate sources. You're going to have some population increase, etc. Right? You think about something like tobacco moving over here, right? It's going to have global consequences. We talked about cacao in class, right? This was this Aztec Maya product that the Spanish take up, right? And becomes an important global product, right? Most of it now is actually grown in West Africa, right? Now, the other part of this, producing wealth, got silver too, right? So you're trying to pay back these creditors and you're trying to make a profit, right? So you've got the plantation system that's developing for sugar to make money, but then, you have this supply of silver too, if you can get it out of the ground, right? And these are these Spanish reals, right? Some of the first coins that were minted in Mexico City. And we looked at some of these documents before. So if you want to take a second to pause and read through this. So this is the Ming Dynasty official, right? So a lot of the silver is going to China, right? So go back and do your reading on this. Marx has a good section on the global silver economy. talking about the importance of this stuff to the Chinese economy, right? And just how much of it's coming out of Spain, right? And then we also have the perspective of a Spanish priest who is in the Caribbean at this time, right? I'm sorry, in South America at this time, right? Where he's talking about the mines at Potosi in what's today Bolivia. Right? And I have two from him. Okay? So take a second with this one. And then one more. If you remember, we looked at these in class as well, right? We're looking at these labor systems, right? And how the Spanish are forcing these indigenous people into these different labor systems, right? The encomienda system primarily in the northern part of the colony, and then in Bolivia and the Andes Mountains, they're going to use this mita system, right? That was already in place by the Inca, right? That was their labor system that they had, and they're going to use it primarily for silver here. Right? Really, really, absolutely brutal system, right? And if you remember the images we looked at as well, right? Now you have to bring it down, right? There's the pack animals, the llama, right? You bring it into the city of Potosi, and this is where it's processed, right? You have to smelt it. And this is also where the mercury comes in. If you remember, we did some readings on the environmental consequences of silver smelting in the Andes at Potosi. And mercury is a huge problem, right? Drove people crazy, literally, right? It's a very dangerous product to use, right? And then that's a image of the city of Potosi itself, highest city in Latin America, one of the biggest cities in the Americas at this time. Really bizarre place to put a city, really environmentally not very friendly, right? The winds are just outrageous in Potosi. Still there, the mine is still being used. You still have people going down into this mountain, right? Still to this day. Now, where's the silver going, right? Now you have some of it, obviously, coming to Europe, right, to Seville and eventually to Italy to pay off these debts. But you also have some of it coming across the Pacific to Manila, and this is where that Chinese trade is occurring, right? You're bringing in these products from China to the Philippines, back to Mexico, to Europe, right? So another look at it. I love maps, so I have a couple of these on here for you. Okay. Really interesting way to look at it. Okay. And you can just kind of ride these trade routes, these trade winds, right? And currents. So some of the products that came back from China being specifically made for the Spanish market, right? So again, remember, China is this mass producer of global goods still during this time period, right? Even though you have Europe going out, starting this early capitalism, colonialism, etc., that continuity that we're looking for in this time period are Asian goods, right? They are still the major products that are being traded in the world at this time, right? So a couple of things we can look at here, right? These are made in China specifically for this Spanish market, right? These Christian icons. Right? So again, that's that continuity, right? China still maintains its dominance in production, right? Europeans are just moving it around to different places in the world. Right? Now, let's look at this idea of colonialism in the Americas, right? So we can kind of refresh how this goes down, right? Because before you can set up these sugar plantations, before you can set up these silver mines, right, we need a little context on how that got to that point, okay? And just as a refresher, what was already happening here, right? You had the Aztec Empire in Mexico, right? This kind of core periphery situation that we had going on here. And that's actually beneficial to the Spanish, right? You have these kind of tributary states out here that aren't really that happy with the core, right? They're being exploited. So the Spanish can take advantage of that. They can get some of these people to help them take down the Aztec Empire, right? Which It's not the key, but it's very helpful, right? There's something else that's going to play a key role in bringing down this empire. It also has to do with the Columbian Exchange, right? Absolutely amazing city. It's on a lake, right? When Cortez gets here, he's shocked. If you remember the letters we read from Cortez to the rulers of Spain at this time, and he's just beyond himself at what he's finding here, right? He's talking about how large the city is, how many products they have available. He says you can basically get anything you could ever want, right? At Tenochtitlan, right? And here you've got aqueducts, right? I mean, really, really well-established civilization, right? So how are they able to take them down, right? And really, we have to look at disease, right? This is the real key here. Is European essentially being a disease vector for smallpox, right? They bring it with them and they infect the indigenous people who do not have an immune response to this, right? Remember, these two continents have been separated, right? So smallpox does not exist in the Americas. So there is no immune response. And it's absolutely devastating, right? You have this massive mortality rate. So this raises questions, right? Who's going to grow the food if all these people are sick, right? And that's something we're looking at right now, honestly, right? You look at the meat packing plants, if you're watching the news, and that's a concern we have right now with COVID, right? What happens to the food supply, right? Who cares for the sick in these situations, right? Again, another issue we have right now with coronavirus, right? Do they have what they need, right? Is there enough of them? Are they going to be able to get the job done, right? This is hard to do, right? Who's going to govern, right? If people are sick, right? Are people in leadership positions coming down with this illness? It's going to cause huge problems. And then, of course, military preparedness. If your military is being hit by this as well, how do you defend yourself against Spanish attack, right? So it creates huge problems, right? That probably more than anything are going to contribute to the success of Europeans in the New World. If they didn't have this kind of biological weapon with them, it's hard to see the Europeans being successful as fast as they were. Right? I mean, yes, they had some gunpowder weapons, but not enough, I don't think. And it's really hard to see them coming up against this massive population of indigenous people, these very structured civilizations, and being victorious, right? With just the few people they brought over. So don't forget the importance of the Columbian Exchange and the Great Dying, right? And this Europeans bringing the smallpox over, and it's hard to stress how important that was to the way this history plays out, right? And you can see the victory they have here. This is where the Templo Mayor used to be at the Aztec capital. And then this is the main Catholic cathedral that was built in its place. Actually, a lot of it was built from the stones from these Aztec temples. So they literally rebuilt them into European religious institutions. Right? And the DBQ that I will post with this, that College Board put up for us, actually deals with the role of Christianity in the Americas. Right? So this will help give you some context on a little background on how you get to the point where there is Christianity in the Americas, right? Now, another thing we should look at when we look at colonization is cultural diffusion, cultural syncretism, these relationships between Europeans and native people, right? And this is something we looked at when we were looking at this concept of chocolate, right? Was how did these Europeans come to be chocolate drinkers, right? Well, how did that go down, right? And then we read from Marcy Norton, who's a really preeminent scholar on this stuff. So if you want to take a second to pause and refresh yourself on what Norton said about this. So if you remember, there are not a lot of Spanish women here, right? So you have these Spanish men who, through formal unions, sometimes forced unions, they're living with these indigenous women who are preparing indigenous foods for them. So they are acculturating these Spanish men to indigenous culture, right? And the one item we looked at from that obviously was cacao, chocolate, right? Now, once you have these Spanish indigenous relationships, or even Spanish African relationships, right? Things are starting to get mixed up here, right? And the Spanish, their way of dealing with this is to try to create a hierarchy out of it, right? This is kind of where that idea of European or white supremacy is going to start to arise from in the Americas, right? These categories that they're going to try to establish, right? Pure blood Spanish, they're going to put themselves at the top, right? The Peninsulares, right? And then everybody else will be below them, right? All these different mixed groups of people. And if you remember, we looked at these Costas paintings, which shows the different relationships, right? So you've got the man, the woman, and the child, right? And then don't forget that the roots of this go back to the Reconquista in Spain, right? Remember, Spain and Portugal were part of that Muslim world for about 600 years, right? And then you had the Christian kingdoms who pushed them out. That was part of that, what they called the Reconquista. They expelled any Arabs who were left and any of the Jewish population, right? So this kind of has roots in that, right? This distinction based on this idea of race, right? Which is essentially an invention, but they're going to roll with it, right? This is how you maintain power politically and economically, right? You kind of categorize people and put those folks below you, right? So again, right, these colonists are mostly male, right? Peninsulares, born in Spain, right? They're at the top, right? But again, you have this dearth of Spanish women, so you get these relationships, right? So you have the Spanish man, probably an elite indigenous woman, and then their child, right? A mestizo, right? They're obsessed with this stuff, right? They are obsessed with these kind of classifications. It's a really kind of bizarre obsession that has really dangerous consequences, right, for the future. We still live with a lot of the stuff in Latin America, and of course we had our own version of it in the United States too, right? I think I have a couple more images in here. Yeah, so these are some we looked at in class too, right? Really weird sets of paintings, right? Really interesting artifacts. And then again, I just want to bring back this idea that you have this diffusion of Christianity. And again, a lot of that's happening through this process, right? Spanish man with his African or indigenous wife. You also have a lot of missionary activity coming in, conversion of indigenous peoples. Right? Here you have Potosi portrayed as a Catholic saint, right? So again, your DBQ will delve into this a little bit more. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the diffusion and syncretism of Christianity, because you do have 5 documents that are going to get into that, right? And if you remember, we watched this in class. We're not going to take the time to do it now. If you want to, you can search for it on YouTube, right? All right, now let's turn away from Spain for a minute and what was happening in the Americas in terms of the Costas, etc., and bring Africa into this system, right? Last time, 1200 to 1450, we took a look at what was happening in East Africa primarily, right? And then also don't forget 1200 to 1450, West Africa up here in Mali. Don't forget Mansa Musa, all of that previously, right? So that's previous, right? So now let's turn our attention to Africa again and see what's going to happen here. So primarily, we'll concern ourselves with West Africa here. And once you have this transatlantic slave trade happening, what does that mean internally in West Africa? And then what does it mean externally with this African diaspora to the Americas, right? And this is a great document to kind of get to the heart of what's happening internally in Africa, right? And in West Africa. And this really throws the political situation in West Africa into turmoil, right? As you move away from the old system of slavery in West Africa, which is basically based on prisoners of war. Go back and look at that old African slavery, right? And then we can compare that to how that's going to change with this chattel plantation style of slavery, right? So if you have the Europeans arriving, wanting to buy more and more and more people, right? How are you going to supply those people, right? So now you start to get a competition between these West African nations over, who's going to deal with these Europeans, right? Now, in the beginning, you take a place like Congo, for example, which we looked at. They're not going to sell their own people, right? They're going to sell prisoners of war. So you get into this kind of cycle of warfare, which oftentimes is egged on and promoted by European powers too. And you can see that in this document, right? Where we're looking at the role of the Dutch and the Portuguese in internal African affairs, right? And you've got Zinga, who is trying to kind of play off of these European powers to set herself up in a decent position to rule, right? And if you remember, we watched a really excellent video from Henry Louis Gates' Great Civilizations of Africa, where they looked at that episode with Queen Zinga and her response to what was happening there. And that was Zinga, right? And on the topic of gender, right? Those kind of gender issues off balance in West Africa too, right? Because the West African slave trade is primarily a male-dominated slave trade, right? So you are essentially leaving the women of West Africa to take up the slack, right? In terms of labor, etc. Right? As you get a disproportionate number of men being taken out. Right? Now, if we turn to the diaspora itself and try to take a look at what's happening in the Americas here, we can see why this is happening, right? Sugar, huge role in this. This is number one, right? 54% of the slaves that are being brought in these early years are coming to work on these sugar plantations, right? They're being forced onto these really brutal conditions. And then you've got coffee, mines, etc. Right? And then you look at the regions where they're going. Brazil, biggest one, right? 35% of slaves are going to Brazil. Sugar plantations, gold mining, diamond mining. Then you got the Spanish Empire, again, silver mining, sugar plantations, etc. You get into the West Indies, Britain, France, British West Indies, as you were thinking about Jamaica, Barbados, etc. French West Indies, we're looking at Haiti, right? Again, this is all about sugar, right? And then you look at British North America and the United States, 4.4%. Okay? So we really need to globalize our thinking about this transatlantic slave trade, right? It didn't all occur here. In fact, most of it is happening south of us, right? In these more tropical climates. Right? Because again, right, sugar production is super, super labor intensive. Right? And we'll come back to that with my next video on the last time period, right? We'll look at the Haitian Revolution in there. Right? Now, some of the effects of this African diaspora, right? You've got a lot of religious syncretism happening. So if you remember, we looked at Brazil as an example, candomblé, right? This syncretic blend of West African beliefs with some of the Catholic beliefs, right? That are present in Brazil. Now, this was not accepted by the Catholic authorities there, right? They're heavily persecuted, right? They were subject to Inquisition, which was putting them on trial for their religious beliefs, right? So a lot of this stuff has to be done in secret, right? You can't do it in the open like you can today. Right? And then another one we looked at was the idea of capoeira, right? Which is kind of a blending of culture attributes with resistance, right? So this was this Afro-Brazilian martial art, right? And we looked at some videos of that as well. So if you remember in the video, Skip Gates is talking to some people that practice capoeira, and he was explaining that as they're training, if they saw an authority figure come up, they would think they were dancing, right? That was the idea. You have to do this stuff hidden, sometimes hidden in plain sight, right? So they don't really know what you're doing. Right? Which leads us into the concept of these Maroon communities, right? These large runaway communities of say formerly enslaved people, right? They freed themselves, right? You see this all over the Caribbean and in regions of the United States too. Anywhere you have this chattel slavery, you're going to have people fleeing, right, and setting up these runaway communities to resist this system. Okay, and oftentimes it's not just African Americans who are coming to these places, right? It's other people who are being discriminated against as well, right? Native peoples, sometimes even poor, exploited European Americans too. Right? And of course, with this, you're going to get these syncretic cultures developing too. Right? And if you look at this in Jamaica, this idea of rebellion, it's not just Maroon communities, right? It's not just escape, but it's actually violent resistance too. And you have a really significant rebellion in Jamaica in 1770, 1771. And then this is from Edward Long. And if you'll pause it and see what he has to say about this, it's really quite interesting. And what I find interesting in here is the coordination that they see, right? This wasn't necessarily just a spontaneous outbreak of violence against a particular incidents that happened, right? What they're saying is this was planned out. This was very strategic, right? They had networks of communication, etc. So this is a mass resistance movement, right? This is organization amongst oppressed people, right? Who the British, honestly didn't think that they were capable of, right? So this really shocks the British, and it's put down pretty brutally, but it shows that this is not a passive thing, right? There's organization, there is synchronized resistance here amongst these groups of people. They're communicating, right? They're trying to overthrow the system, which we'll actually see happen in French Haiti, right? In this next time period, right? With the Haitian Revolution, right? They're successful. And if we look at the United States too, in our own backyard, right? You see these, this is a great map where we can see where Maroon communities and slave revolts are breaking out from the 17th to the 19th century, right? Spanish Florida, big area for Maroon communities, right? Lots of swamps down here in the Everglades. So you get a really interesting culture down here with the Seminole, who are taking in a lot of runaway enslaved people and integrating them into their societies, right? So you get this really interesting syncretism here in Florida too, between these people of the African diaspora and then the indigenous people of Spanish Florida, right? Really fascinating place. Now, last thing I want to look at is I do want to return to the Dutch, right? We talked about them at the very beginning. As kind of the next step after the Spanish Portuguese, the Iberian attempt at this kind of global hegemony, right? Trying to be this dominant power. And as we said at the beginning, the Dutch had another advantage, right? They're not reliant on other regions for their financing so much, right? As Spain was with the Italian city-state of Genoa, right? Genoa. The Dutch are going to do it internally, right? They're going to have their own stock market. They're going to have these joint stock companies where the people of the Netherlands themselves can make the investments, right? Painting of the courtyard at the stock exchange. This is the first stock exchange in Europe, right? It's in Amsterdam. Copy of one of the oldest known stock certificates, right, which is issued by the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, right, where people are investing in these ships. And this is, this is early capitalism, right, where you have the system based on trading and shipping and private finance, right? This is capital, right? People are investing capital into these ships, right? Hoping for a return on their investment, okay? They end up with the largest merchant fleet in the world, the Dutch Um, and to just take a, another look at these joint stock companies, they're financing these flutes, right, which are these Dutch ships, right? So kind of a simple way to look at that is, you've got, say 16 investors in this ship. Each of them holds 1/16 of a share, right? So if the ship goes down, it doesn't make it back, you're not the sole investor in this, right? You've only lost a small amount of money, and you can spread your investments out, right? You don't want to invest in just one ship. Maybe you're going to invest a 16th of a share in 5 different ships, right? And 4 of them will make it back. So it's gambling, right? I mean, that's essentially what it is, which is kind of what the world of finance capitalism is, right? You're betting that the money you invest in it, that you can grow that money, right? I mean, that's kind of how it works. Now, what this means is these joint stock companies, the Dutch East India Company is responsible to one thing, right? Their shareholders, right? They have to bring back a return on that investment. Right? They have to make money for these guys. So that's the primary concern, right? It's not about really anything else. It's about making sure that these investments are repaid and that there's profit made off of it, right? Which is really pretty much still how capitalism works today, right? You can see some of the negative consequences of capitalism today, right? We have a fossil fuel economy, right? That's not a good thing, right? I think we all understand that's creating some very, very terrible consequences, right? Everything from climate change to war in the Middle East, etc. But again, for these oil companies, that's not what it's about for them, right? It's about making money for their investors. Okay, so when we look at Dutch capitalism, you'll kind of see that same idea in a place like Indonesia, right, where they're going to establish this monopoly on nutmeg, right? And these Dutch East India Company, they have a wide latitude to do whatever they want. They can declare war, they can negotiate peace, they can set up colonies, they can mint their own coins. I mean, it is a truly powerful corporation in a sense, right? And again, their primary goal here is to make money for their investors, right? That's the whole idea. So you look at a place like Indonesia, and we take a look at what they did to make money in Indonesia for their investors, and it's really horrible, right? We did some readings on this where they're going to set up this monopoly on nutmeg, right? They're going to do this essentially through war, genocide, and slavery, right? And you have some readings on that. So if you go back through your binder, you should be able to find those and see how this plays out. Because again, right, it's about paying your investors back, right? Not about how you treat the people who are doing the work for you, right? That's not your consideration. In fact, you want to extract as much labor from these people as you possibly can for as cheap as a price as you possibly can, because that again makes more money for your investors. Okay? If you want to, and again, I'm not going to show this to you, you can take some time to do it yourself. John Green digs a little bit deeper into the Dutch East India Company in his video on early capitalism. So go back and watch that. Okay? Really handy video. All right, so let's kind of review what we've done here. Okay, we're looking at the extent to which these global exchange networks were transformed, right? So let's think about these big changes that happen, right? You've got the Europeans entering this world system now in a major way, right? They're going to set up new systems, right? Atlantic and Pacific systems are going to be established, which essentially creates a truly global system for the first time, right? And that's if you want to get historiographical about this, that's where Emanuel Wallerstein, our guy who looks at this world system theory, kind of started his research was with this early world system that develops with European entry. And a lot of this is due to European mercantilism and this early capitalism that's coming out of here, right? That's a huge change, right? We looked at that multipolar world system before. This is a different system, right? These guys are trying to corner the markets on these things. They're trying to set up monopolies again, so they can pay back these investors, right? The Spanish got to pay back the Genovese bankers, right? The Dutch have to pay back these investors in their own country, right? And of course, one of the bigger changes too is you get colonialism, right? This is the start of that, right? In the Americas and Asia and Africa, right? Now, it's not during this period that you see this full imperialism that we'll see in this next time period, but this is the origins of that, especially in the Americas, right? I mean, you really start to see the Spanish colonize the Americas during this period, obviously. And then you look at North America too. We're starting to see the East Coast with the British, the French, Mississippi River being colonized as well. So what does this mean though? You've got these big changes, but what do we need to know about them, right? Well, this brings a diffusion of Christianity, syncretism between Christianity and other faiths, right? And again, that's that DBQ you're going to be looking at today, right? You get armed trading in the Indian Ocean, which you saw on your last DBQ about Portugal in the Indian Ocean, which, you know, I didn't talk about that today. That was done in your DBQ. So if you want to get into Portugal's role in the Indian Ocean, you need to go back and look at that. That DBQ, those documents are really well put together. They give you a good idea of what's happening there. Okay? You get these new social hierarchies developing, right, on these European models, right? The casta system, right? The system of chattel slavery is a social and economic hierarchy, right? So these are new things in the world, right, that are really starting to be solidified and put in place. Right? You get these new forced labor systems that are obviously tied in with these social hierarchies too, right? Encomienda, mita, chattel slavery, right, coming off of these European models, okay? Which obviously are going to have consequences in the future too, okay? And of course, this is where you get this African diaspora, right? You're starting to bring people into the Americas from West Africa too, right? And we looked at some of the syncretism, et cetera, that's going to come from that. And, you know, we'll come back in the next one and look at how that's going to end, right? What does that abolition movement look like? You know, we looked a little bit today at some of the resistance movements from African diaspora peoples themselves too. Right? And we'll continue that a little bit in the future. Right? Columbian exchange, huge effect of all of this, right? This exchange of plants, animals, and then, you know, the effect of the disease. Don't forget about that, right? That is a huge deal, okay? And in terms of plants, a couple you want to think about, right? Think about sugar coming to the New World, right? What effect is that going to have? And you can think about corn, potatoes going to Afro-Eurasia, right? The effect on population there, right? And then, you know, you develop this global silver trade that we looked at a little bit today. We looked at it in class. And again, go back and read Marx on this, right? He does a great job of explaining this global silver trade in just a couple of pages. So make sure you go back and you're rereading your Marx. Because again, great summary of what we've looked at this year. And I've said this before, you know, Marx, his book really does follow that AP curriculum really well. So please make sure you're reading your Marx, okay? All right, so we'll end there for today. And I will post a DBQ for this time period for you guys to work on, and you can submit that to me and I can get that back to you, okay? So I'll do another video on 1750 to 1900, and we'll look at that last time period and then the big changes and continuities that are going to occur there too. And then I'll give you another DBQ to go with that too, which actually has already been posted. I've had some of you already submit that to me. So that's already out there. It's on the College Board website. So if you want to get a jump start on that one, feel free. Now you can do that before I post the video. All right. Thanks, guys. Miss you guys, and hope you're well. Thank you.